Welcome to New Mexico Black Rifle Operators Union. I'm your host, Sean, and I was a little challenged at what I was going to talk about on this podcast for tomorrow, and the reason why is there's not anything really new going on in the 2A world that I haven't spoken on, at least in the political spaces. I can give you a news update, which I think is kind of hilarious, that Hunter Biden's deal fell through. If you didn't hear, he had a plea deal agreement for some tax evasion charges and some firearms charges, and they were going to plea them down to get him a slap on the wrist because, you know, he's a rich politician, so he's probably not going to see some time. However, the judge today kind of called out some things about a FARA incident, which is a foreign agents, not registering foreign agents. And that's interesting that, you know, we all know what Hunter's supposedly had done or has done. There's enough out that you can honestly definitively say he probably did this, and he is probably guilty as hell, just like Joe Biden. At the same time this came out, which I think is kind of interesting that the government would do this, they had a UFO hearing in Congress, and in that that bombshell hearing, what you heard was that there was non-human biologics that came out of this. That was the biggest bombshell. There, I saved you the two big stories. The one that was more interesting in the news is that Mitch McConnell seemed to, short circuit for 30 seconds while having a press conference. That's a sign of our politicians are too damn old to be in office, but we know this. But it leads me down this path of something kind of unique for the 2A world. And I was thinking about this just a little bit ago about what are the new classic firearms going to be? You know, like when you go to a gun show, if you still go to a gun show. I go to a gun show to check out firearms, and I'm a big person that's into military surplus weapons. So like the K98s, I know a lot about them. I collect them. I have a few of them. I have a K98 from Israel that is a 308 7.62. To my knowledge, there's only 4,000 of these particular rifles, and I happen to have one in good working order that I inherited. I have an original German K98. I have a Brazilian K98 that is a 7mm Mauser. I have K98s that were turned into other calibers, so I have an 8mm 6 and an 8mm Mauser. But what I was getting at is, to me, the Mauser is a classic icon, just like the Winchester Model 70 or the Remington Model 700. The Remington Model 700, to my knowledge, is still being produced, even though Remington's went defunct. There's a company now that's trying to do that. And there's a lot of people that have made chassis for the 700 Action so that you can make new calibers. Now, or build a gun and make your own caliber, basically, or use an existing caliber. Now, what's interesting to me is thinking about this as is the AR-15 going to be a classic gun in the future? And the reason why I'm saying this is how many companies have made AR-15s. So there's PSA. Let's cover the cheaper ones first. PSA, Anderson. You have CMMG. You have Plum Crazy, who makes a lower that's polymer, which I think they're now some other company because they were bought out. But you have Daniel Defense. You have a litany. You have DPMS, who's still making them, which DPMS is now owned by Palmetto State Armory, if you didn't know that. But it makes me think about them and my favorite rifle, the AK. Now the AK, there's several variants in several countries that make them, so you could see the K98. There'd be a Yugoslavian versus a Russian versus a Bulgarian AK. So there's variances in how they're made and who made them. But with the AR-15, that's not the case. That's kind of why we like the AR-15, is that we can swap parts as we need to, and that's one of the big draws to it, and the modularity. But thinking in the future, what are the classic guns of modern times? Is it the X95? So if you don't know what the X95, they're made by IWI. They're the Tavor. They're the updated Tavor. Is it the Steyr-AUG? Because the Steyr-AUG's still in rotation. Is it the FAL? Because DSA is now making the FAL and classic patterns, as well as newer patterns. Is it the Galil Ace, made by IWI again? Is it, what are our classic firearms of the future going to be? You know, they're firearms that we have that are heirlooms that will be handed down. You know, these ones I've inherited from my father, some of them. A lot of them I've purchased myself that are classic military firearms. But if you look at the modern military firearms, we're never going to get to touch them. Look at the G36, the German G36. German G36 is a polymer gun, polymer receiver. And there was a lot of controversy around it because the polymer was supposedly getting soft in hotter environments, and the German Bundeswehr never really tested it to some of the extremes that they pushed it through. What is found out later in testing is that their barrels are kind of being shot out because the Germans don't replace their rifles as rapidly as we do. So that wasn't really an issue. You're not going to fire 300 rounds in a firefight. If you do, you're on the losing end of a firefight. But we're never going to see them because of the import bans and because of the restrictions that the government has put on us to get modern military rifles or modern rifles in general. There's a limit on what we can get. So what are the future classic firearms? You know, is the Strybog, which is a 9mm PCC. That's kind of an interesting gun. How about CMMG's Banshee? You know, that's also an interesting gun because it's a PCC. And I'm sticking to, you know, the ones I'm just thinking off the top of my head. But, you know, what is the M1 Grand of our century, of our lifetime? And it has to be definitively said that it's the AR-15 or the M16. Well, we can't have an M16. Well, some of us can if you have enough money, but the vast majority of us don't. We have the AR-15. And yeah, that's going to be a classic firearm to some degree, I believe, especially those ones that are higher end or some that were made by a company that was just known for making exceptional firearms. But the reason why I don't believe they'll be a true classic like the M1 Grand is because they're still going to be in service. You know, the AR-15 is one of the most prolific rifles in the United States. And it's like I say all the time, it's like saying Honda Civic or car. You know, the AR-15 has become a ubiquitous term for modern sporting rifle, and there's a crap ton of them out there by a crap ton of companies. And even if you were to collect all of them, you still wouldn't be able to collect all the variances if you're an average working person. So is that the classic one? Then I started thinking about pistols. Now there is where it gets really interesting because there's a variety of pistols that could be classic in the future, or it could be held and have some value. HK pistols, for instance, Glock pistols to some degree, because there's variances between each generation of the Glock pistol. You know, that same subtlety could be said for like the Colt Single Action Army. Before it came out, you know, the revolver was just a revolver, you know. The Single Action Army, there were generational changes that make them distinctly different. Look at Beretta, the Beretta 92. There are several different variants of that gun, up to the A3, which was up for military adoption but was refused in light of the SIG. Look at the SIG pistols. You know, you look at the SIG P229, the P228, the P320, the P365. They're all different. They're all unique. And then you start adding that they have, what's it called? The Talon. Their Talon version, which is supposed to be the high-end one. Is the Deagle, the Desert Eagle, going to be a classic firearm in the future? You know, when I'm looking at the firearms of our current generation, I'm looking more at pistols nowadays, thinking that these are more what a collector would want because they're different. You know, the AR-15 to me is kind of generic nowadays. To be honest, so is the AK. The AK has variants, like I said, from different countries, but it's still the same gun. It's still the same pattern. Its modularity is never going to be what the AR-15 is. The flip side of that coin, though, is that the AR-15 is so modular, maybe they'll still be in service, like I said, and that, you know, the weapon you made for yourself or whatever purpose you made, when you hand it down or it finally becomes that age to where you hand it to your children or your grandchildren, it's going to be because you used it that it's going to have some provenance. And that's what I was talking about, is that provenance of firearms. We don't have anything that is so unique nowadays that you look at it and go, hey, that's kind of different. The AR-180s, we're going to see a ton of AR-180 builds, and you're going to see things like the Jackal. Is the Jackal going to be something worth a fortune later on? Is it going to be the classic? So when I'm looking at these guns, it's just something to think about. Where has technology taken us? Have we advanced to the point that we're kind of stagnant? And I think that's where we're at, is that you can only take a technology that's been around for hundreds of years and advance it so far. Where's the new innovation that makes us move to the next step? Where is, and better question is, when they get those weapons, are we going to have them as civilians? Are they going to allow us to have a civilian version of it? If there ever isn't a laser gun that is the first one that the military uses, are we going to get a civilianized version of it? And I'm looking at this stuff thinking, probably not, unless we change something in Congress, And that's what's sad, is there's a lot of history and story tied up in the arms of the world. Take the Mauser, for instance. It took him from 1871 until 1898 to get to the K98. And then there were several iterations after that he made semi-automatic loading rifles, Paul Mauser, that is, before he passed away. And right up until World War II. Where are those stories and the innovations there that we're seeing that are captured in those examples, those physical examples of what they are? A direct impingement AR-15 is a direct impingement AR-15, and that they're made to be that way. You can swap one upper for another. That's the whole point, is their modularity. But where's the classic provenance that we're missing? You see a 1965 Mustang rolling down the street, and you're like, wow, that's cool, because it's different compared to modern examples of the Mustang. But it's still, you can still see some of its genealogy there. Now, we see some of that genealogy in our firearms technology we have now. But where is that provenance when you look at something that is distinctively there that you want to keep and that you could see as a collector? Now, I know many people, one of my friends, for an example, the AR-15 is his primary rifle for everything. He has it in every caliber I think you can think of, and a lot of other variants. He likes the rifle. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying anything's wrong with that at all. And if that's what you want to collect, great. But to an average person who just sees it, it's just a car. It's just a rifle to me. It's just a tool. That's great. But when you look at the story behind where my K98s came from, for example, I just mentioned that one of them came from Israel. It was used when Israel was being made a country. Okay? What about the Brazilian 7mm Mauser? How do I know what it is? It's because of the stamping. It's because of its country of origin markings. But you can still see the DNA of the K98. When you look at a Model 70, I have a Model 70 I inherited from my dad. And in looking at that, I can see Mauser's work at hand still. And if you think about it, back to when these guns were being made, they had to license parts of those technologies to make these newer versions of them, or newer at the time. Go to a gun store and you see the guns, and to me, it's getting to the point where they all look the same. You look at a Bergara rifle, and I see the DNA of a Remington 700. It has better features or better ergonomics, but it's still basically the same principle. Mauser makes a new rifle now. I'd like to have one to add to my collection just because it's I've always collected Mausers. But it's not different than any of the newer rifles. So that's where I have the heartburn lately when I look at the firearms industry in the world right now. I'm like, it's kind of that thing. It's a car. It's a tool. And I know that's how we're supposed to see it in some ways, but there is no spark of interest nowadays in some of the firearms. You can only see a Glock 19 so many times, no matter how many generations, before you know it's just a Glock. Where is that cool factor? Tim from Military Arms Channel showed off something that I actually kind of perked up and was like, wow, that's kind of interesting. And what it is it's a $4,000 gun, for one, which means it's squarely out of my price range until something changes, or, I win the lottery, or my business takes off, or I find a new job, whatever the future holds for me there. But it was a Gatling gun, a 22 long rifle caliber, belt-fed Gatling gun. And to me, that was interesting because you can't see those examples of what an original Gatling gun is in your hand. But you could purchase one of these and see how they work. And you could actually take it apart, because in the maintenance manual he was going through it, it shows you those pieces. And that's interesting to me, and I see that as a collectible that'll be worth something in the future. But when you look at the newer guns, what are they? The SCAR. Maybe the SCAR is the new collectible. And we've gotten so cookie cutter with our modern firearms that we are lacking in innovation in a way, because they're all either short stroke gas piston, long stroke gas piston, or direct impingement guns. Now, we all know those systems work, but where's the difference that makes something stand out? And that's what I'm talking about when we're talking about collectible guns. I am a collector. I'll always be a collector. I've thought about getting my classic firearms collecting license so I could just have guns over 100 years shipped directly to my home. The problem is that the prices for those guns that I'm very interested in have climbed so dramatically that they're squarely coming out of my price ranges. My K98, for a version like mine, an example just like mine, it's probably going to cost you $1,100 because it is cherry. And when I say cherry, I mean the stock may have a ding here or there because it was used in military service, and you can tell it's still got the Waffenamps on it. Parts of it the bluing is worn off, so they're in the white. But it's still a prime example. When you look at the bore of the gun is perfect. You look at the trigger is great. It's a perfect example of what a K98 is. And I've talked a lot of smack about like the Russian garbage rod, but there's people that collect those because they have just as much variation as my Mauser. I'm just prejudiced because I like the Mauser. I've shot the garbage rod, and it is cumbersome. And you could tell that it is cumbersome just by looking at it when you operate the bolt. If you physically get one in your hand, check out the bolt and compare it to a Mauser or compare it to a modern, like a Remington 700. And what you notice is that there's a reason why technology advances. And there's a reason why these weapons were made in the way they were. But that provenance, that difference, is what I see lacking nowadays in the firearms community, or not the community. The community is very diverse, but in the collector spaces, in the new firearms being produced, there's nothing that rings my bell. You see a brand new AR-15 come out, and unless it's some sort of new whiz-bang caliber, and then the caliber is what interests me more than the rifle, there's no draw to it. And I think that's something that needs to change. And I think the new generation hopefully will change that. There's new technology such as 3D printing that we're going to see a lot of firearms come out in different configurations and different mechanisms and different ways that'll make them more interesting. But will they be collectible because some dude just printed that one off? That's what I think is where we're headed to, is we're at that cookie cutter stage in human society that gun culture is kind of stagnated when it came to making new things. Now, the pistols, they're still using Browning's basic design, but how they use it is different. How they look is dramatically different. And it's kind of an interesting thing. I could chatter on about this, and I could chatter on about the news, but I gave you the highlights of the day. There's nothing really big that's gone on other than those stories. Those are the ones that drew my attention. But it was making me think about how culture seems to have stagnated all the way around. In the 80s, you look at the firearms that came out, and there was a lot of draw to them. The Uzi was a big one that I was like, ooh, the MP5, even though it had been around since the 60s. These are things that you'd see that are different. M16s, you could buy M16s up until 1986. We've lost a lot of that cultural heritage that our government has pushed on us by legislation. Like, share, subscribe, be great.
In the top, I can't let it slide. My politics are rather controversial. Who would have thought that I ain't catching all slack and I